So I came across this article and I saw the term fancy girls. Now, I heard of this term before, but I did not know it was related to light-skinned enslaved girls. So we're going to talk about this a bit. Now, the article does not talk about this in depth, so I had to do a little bit more research, go through some slave narratives to get a better understanding of what was going on at this time. So fancy girls are basically light-skinned enslaved girls that were bred for the purpose of sex. Now, these women were already enslaved, but they were specifically bred to be living sex slaves for slave owners and for people, politicians, people who were wealthy. Let me not broaden this to people, I mean white men who were in power and wealthy. So let's discuss when the fancy trade began. What is the fancy trade? It's the trade of these fancy girls that were bred for the specific purpose of sex. In the early 1800s, this started to gain traction because after the women were raped and they were bearing children from white men, the children were coming out lighter and in their eyes better looking than the dark-skinned women. White men had an appetite for these light-skinned women who they deemed as better looking than the dark-skinned women. Now, plantations already had breeding farms for slaves, but these type of slaves that they were breeding, they had to be light-skinned. So, of course, white men were raping enslaved women to get pregnant. Now, you can imagine the devastation of this because most of these girls were young. Some of them weren't even barely in their teens. And so they would have them on these plantations and they would be raping them. They would get pregnant. They would let the babies grow up at least till, I think some of them had accounts of 11 to 12 and maybe 13 years old before they actually sold them off. And so they were auctioned off. These young girls would have to stand in front of a group of wealthy, privileged men and be auctioned off. In some of the journals, they say that they would have to take off their clothes. They would have to walk. There were certain things that they want them to do before they actually purchase them. The main states that had these type of auctions, the top two were New Orleans and Mississippi. New Orleans had the largest fancy trade because people came from all over the world, not just the states. The research that I found also talks about how the light-skinned girls were separated from the other slaves. They were not even in the same quarters, and they were treated differently, but they were still treated with brutality. Some of them were fed better, they had better clothing, but they were constantly beaten, abused, mistreated, and they had no rights. They also had separate quarters from the other slaves, and this also caused jealousy among the wife of the wealthy enslavers or politicians or whoever had the fancy girls. They would sometimes be abused by the wives because the wives were so jealous. The wealthy white men would also have children with the fancy girls, and their children would be lighter and sometimes passed as white. The article also discusses the constant breeding within the same household. The enslaver would often be sleeping with his daughter because of sexual violence against enslaved women. Fancy ladies did not have a childhood, a father, a mother, and even a right to their body.